Hi Booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be wrapping up everything that I read in the month of September, and then I'll go through some of the plans that I have for October. September was a pretty good reading month. I seem to be, as the year's going on, sort of racking up the numbers in terms of the numbers of books that I'm reading to such a degree it's becoming a little disturbing. I finished 12 books this month. Part of that is because of the reading event Shorty September, so there are a few pretty short books in here. But we'll be starting off with a long book, and actually for like the first half of the wrap up for September, I'll be going at quite a rapid pace because I made 2 random update videos earlier this month. So if you want a little more detail on some of these books, then you can probably pop over there if you're interested. So I started off the month finishing off a very big book, part of quite a big series, at least I suppose a series go, quite a short series. It was The End by Karl Ove Knausgård, the last of his My Struggle books. It's a work of sort of auto-fiction, so he's a kind of semi-fictional life, or life written as if it was a novel, I suppose is more how he thinks of it, I think. And in short, this was, for me, the second most satisfying book of the 6 books. I think book number 2 was the most satisfying for me, and then this, the way everything's brought together, the way essentially my favourite mode of his writing is when he starts to become a little more essayistic, and he sort of unleashes that in here, and it can take some getting used to, but I quite enjoy it, and so for that reason it sort of made it to number 2, even though some of the stuff he's talking about is quite dark or sometimes quite tedious. And then it was also Shaketember, another great annual booktube event where we read the works of William Shakespeare. And on my trusty Kindle, even though this has got Fuji on the front, I prefer having it this way around. Showing the back is a bit more interesting. On my trusty Kindle, which seems to be slowing down, a bit disturbing, I'm not going to think about it too much, I read Twelfth Night, which I very much enjoyed. It's been quite a while since I've read any of Shakespeare's comedies, and I got into this place where every year for Shaketember, almost everything that I was reading was a tragedy, and I think they are my favourite category for his plays. But I love the comedies as well. They just sort of bring, it's a total other side of his writing, and most of the time they get me in a good mood, but also they get you asking interesting questions as well. So there's always a fair bit going on in the comedies. So yeah, I was glad that I sort of altered the trend of my reading a little bit, or I should say actually that Shaketember did, because it was one of the sort of chosen reads. I think it was the one that Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading chose for this year. And then a few more that I've already talked about. The Yellow Wallpaper, great sort of gothic story. But the more I thought about it, the more interesting I thought it was, that it is a story about a mad woman, but from the mad woman's perspective. I think it's something that's brought out in the it's brought out in either the introduction or the afterword, because it's such a short book and it has both. And I read it and I nodded. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then the more I thought about it, the more interesting that kind of becomes. That, yeah, quite often the mad woman in these, particularly in Victorian literature, in the literature sort of leading up to the Yellow Wallpaper, mad women are often peripheral. They're often punished in some kind of way, whether by the characters or, by extension, kind of by the author. and so it is interesting to have that perspective. It's probably one of the first times you kind of got that, in a work of literature, or at least Western literature. But who knows? You can let me know if there are actually way more. And then John Ashberry, selected poems. Won't go into too much detail, but love John Ashberry. I'm still thinking about random lines and images from some of his poems, and there's actually, I think the title of one of his poems in here is the first line of a poem by another poet that I've read, so stay tuned. And then a couple of short poetry books as well. First of which, 3 poems by Hannah Sullivan. Wasn't too impressed with, if I'm being perfectly honest with myself. And Hey Bert by Roberto Pastore. So I suppose kind of double points for Shorty September, which was just, I just sort of went straight to it after reading 3 poems, and it actually worked really well as a kind of a great pick-me-up after reading that. Then this is the last of the ones I'll be flying through, I think. Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which is one of the most fun, one of the most immersive books that I read this month, probably trumped only by one other book here. But yeah, certainly one of the best things I've read in the last month, and probably over the course of the year as well. And then another shorty, just about, Death Threats and Other Stories by Georges Simenon. So some Maigret short stories. I've never read any Maigret books before. I'm going to look to read some more eventually, because I think it's just the right thing. I think after finishing a really big book, it just felt like a nice change of pace, a nice breather. I don't always, there are elements of Maigret that I love as a character. In some ways I think I'd quite get along with him, or wouldn't mind helping him with the gardening or something. but there are elements of his personality that do annoy me a bit as well. And it's interesting with Maigret's stories how he's one of those detectives who has almost supernaturally worked out the case before anyone else, to such a degree that then the whole plot of the whole story kind of seems a bit absurd, because you're like, why is he doing this? Why is he letting this person do this? This makes absolutely no sense at all. And then you realise that the reason things have gone the way they did was because he'd already worked out who'd done it, how it had happened, and he just wanted to bring everything together. A case in point, I think, would be, I think, which one was it? The man on the streets, where there's a crime. A man is murdered with a small gun, and it's reported in the papers that the police have solved it really quickly, that they've found this guy who's done it, and they're going to be doing a reconstruction of the crime to get him to confess. And so they do the reconstruction, and while they're doing it, if I'm remembering the story correctly, while they're doing it, there's this man who seems to be watching them, and then Maigret has some police officers follow him, and then the whole rest of the story is just these police officers, and eventually Maigret himself, following this guy, not, sort of, he's clocked onto the fact that he's being followed, and so he's not going home. So eventually Maigret is not going home, he's following him into every single bar and hotel and restaurant, until he basically runs out of money in his pockets. And I won't say why this guy is being followed, why he turned up at the scene of the crime. but it wasn't directly the reason why, but because this guy knew he was being followed the whole time, it just seems so absurd. Like, why haven't they arrested this guy if they're spending so much time following him? And so that was a really weird one, but it actually paid off, I thought. So it worked quite well. Then the kind of contender with Wolf Hall. So Wolf Hall, one of the best things I've ever read. This one, it probably is one of the best books I've ever read. Might make it onto a top 5 list of my favourite books. And it's Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. And I was talking about this book a lot with my wife as I was reading it because I was so excited. And as I was realising that if you were to summarise this book just in what happens and sort of take away the way it's told, it's still a very touching story, but you could see how in the hands of another novelist it could actually become quite almost saccharine, even though it's dealing with some very dark material. It could be one of those books that's about World War II and concentration camps and all these dark things, and sort of hits you with the feels, and yet still ends up feeling kind of wholesome. If you know those kind of books and films and things that I'm thinking of. Whereas this, it doesn't do that, and because it's W.G. Sebald and he's weird, and he fills you with this sense of unease from the very beginning. And it's so I'll give you the lowdown on what it's about. So on the back here it says, in 1939, 5-year-old Jacques Austerlitz is sent to England on a kinder transport and placed with foster parents. This childless couple promptly erase from the boy all knowledge of his identity, and he grows up ignorant of his past. Later in life, after a career as an architectural historian, Austerlitz, having avoided all clues that might point to his origin, finds the past returning to haunt him, and he is forced to explore what happened to him 50 years before. And that the narrator is someone who just kind of happens upon Austerlitz in a train station when they're both relatively young, and over the years they keep bumping into each other, having conversations, and often a conversation is broken off when they part, and then years later it's resumed from the exact same point by Austerlitz. So he's this very odd person, and yet I think part of what this book has for it is that despite the strangeness, despite how sad a lot of what happens in it is, what kind of prevails is a real empathy for this person. And I don't know how much to spoil, but he's just someone, despite, for a lot of this book, he's a man in his 50s, 60s, and yet he still feels very much like a lost little boy, and you want to look after him. It's just really just lovely, and that's not the most impressive thing about the book, but it's the thing that's kind of stayed behind, if that makes any sense. So I'd say if you're interested in Sebald, you've heard his name come up here and there, I'd say this is a great place to start. It's probably one of the longest of his books. Some of the other books I've read by him have been much shorter, by about 100 pages or so. But I think this is there's a much more straightforward story to this. There's a narrative that underlines the whole thing, whereas The Ring of Saturn or Vertigo, they're not quite as coherent, they're more fragmentary. It's hard to know exactly what's linking all these things together, and you kind of have to piece them together yourself. And there's a little of this in here, but not quite as much. One of the other unexpected things, I suppose, from this book was the place that North Wales held in this book. And I'm going to see if there's a picture somewhere. So when Austerlitz comes to Britain, he's adopted by this Calvinistic Methodist minister and his wife, who have no children, and they live in Bala in North Wales, a small kind of market town in rural North Wales. So it's a kind of a gathering place for a lot of the very small, isolated, rural agricultural communities around there. And it's a spot I know quite well. I used to go there quite a lot when I was little. I grew up like half an hour, 40-minute drive away from Bala. So it was really surreal to hear that mentioned, and many of the other places that we used to visit, like Barmouth and places like that. And there's a bit where he's growing up in this Methodist household. He's going to Sunday school, has a little children's Bible with illustrations, and one of the things he says is that he loved the illustrations, and there's a picture of the Israelites in the desert when they're wandering through the desert with Moses, and it's their camp. And he's saying how this illustration of them is supposed to be the Sinai desert, it's supposed to be the Middle East, and yet it's so craggy that in his own imagination and relating to his own experience, it's really North Wales. And this is the illustration that Sebald decides to use to sort of illustrate that. And speaking as someone who grew up in the same neck of the woods, I'd agree that looks like it could be anywhere in Snowdonia, pretty much. Yeah, that was really cool. And I think that motif of tents in the desert, of displacement, and also that being such a fundamental element of Jewish identity, that's one of many leitmotifs throughout the whole book. Another is a connection between arcs like Noah's Ark and trains. Quite often the two are mentioned quite close together. So this idea of being saved from something, but also of there being some kind of disaster, and then thinking that as a child he was put on a kinder transport, and so there's this association, between trains and salvation, but you have to be saved from something. So there's also a disaster underneath that, and that's the kind of the complexity, I suppose, of what's going on in the book. That nothing's ever quite black and white. The positive feelings always have a reality dragging them down a little bit, but also that there's never anything in here that feels so brutal that you lose hope. So I really, really love this book. It's not a book for everyone, but it's one of my favourite books I've read. And we'll see how long this passion for the book sticks around. 2 more to go for September, both of which I finished today, actually. One on the way into work, one on the way back. To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Again, another one for Shorty September. And I really enjoyed this, really loved it. I was feeling something quite profoundly as I was reading it, but couldn't quite place what it was. And when I was about halfway through, I kind of recognised this image of scaffolding came into my head, because it very much felt like this read of this book, this first reading, was me kind of putting the scaffolding up around the book and kind of working out what's where. But I've still got to do the job. So eventually I'll climb back up that scaffolding and give it another go and read it. But I really enjoyed it, but don't feel like I completely got everything, and so I want to get back to it eventually. And then the last book then, the poetry, the complete poems of Andrew Marvell, who I think with it just being this time of year, I might associate it with going back to school, a new term. Always kind of gets me in the mood for these 16th, 17th century poets like John Donne and Milton and people like that, where I don't know, I just associate them with autumn for some reason. So I thought I'd read some Andrew Marvell, and it was a bit of a mixed bag, really. There are some wonderful poems in here, and many of my favourites are the ones that are really famous anyway. So the mower poems, the mower against the gardens, the mower amongst the glowworms, I think, is another one. To His Coy Mistress, a poem that I've read on this channel for a Poetry Thursday. That's a great poem in here. A lot of the political poems in there were kind of lost on me. I got the historical context to a certain degree, but just didn't particularly enjoy them as poems. And I often don't like things like satires and poems that are kind of dedications or venerations of patrons and friends and things. They're not always the kind of poems that I love. But there was one satire that I did quite enjoy, maybe because it wasn't too long. Sometimes it goes on and on. But there was one about the Netherlands, which was just horrible. I kind of noticed that I probably don't like Andrew Marvell as a person very much. And I think it is that sort of wit and satire that I just generally in literature I don't always enjoy that much. Sometimes I enjoy where I like Oscar Wilde and I like Donne, but I don't know. Sometimes it just leaves a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. But Tom May's Death, which is a poem about the death of Thomas May, who was a contemporary of Marvell. He was hugely influenced by Ben Jonson, and this whole poem is about him dying, going to heaven, and then essentially Ben Jonson just telling him how bad a poet he is and he doesn't deserve to be anywhere near him. And it begins, the first line is, as one put drunk into the packet boat, Tom May was hurried hence and did not know it. As one put drunk into the packet boat is the title of a John Ashberry poem, which I just found interesting that Marvell was a poet that Ashberry was engaging with. But yeah, didn't particularly like him as a character. During the Civil War, he was a bit of a he wasn't really fighting in the Civil War, but everyone's always been a bit unsure of where his allegiance was. And I think he was a bit of a slippery, slimy one who just wanted to say the right thing at the right time. Elements of, as I was sort of mentioning with the poem about the Dutch as well, about the Netherlands, there's a slight kind of xenophobic kind of streak, a kind of anti. It kind of reminds me of the Brexit era, sort of anti-Europe speak, I suppose. It just sort of felt like he was. I don't know. It just felt like a very. I don't know why I feel so insulted for a poem about the Netherlands, but I kind of did, and there are other bits in some of his other poems that aren't quite so savoury either. So yeah, a mixed bag is what I'm trying to say, which is what I said to start with. So before I go on to October's books, I just wanted to do a quick Shorty September wrap up in the middle of this, because I think I've got 3 kinds of shorts, which isn't that impressive. So micro shorts, or Taylor Swift shorts, which is a book of poetry or a book about a breakup. 3 poems. It's a book of poetry, and there's sort of a breakup or a kind of after breakup, getting back together kind of situation in here. So double points, I suppose. Shorts with pockets. So a book with something you can put in the pocket on its cover. I was wondering if you could put a toucan in your pocket. Not entirely sure. And then ripped shorts for mystery, thriller, giallo, something like that. Death threats is a mystery. So I got 3, which isn't too bad. To say I forgot what the prompts were and decided to sort of work it out afterwards, I'm impressed that I actually got any. so that's quite good. And so then, just to finish off, I'm going to go through what I'm reading at the moment and what I want to read in October. The only book that I'm currently reading is Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson. I've been making some pretty good headway in here. I've only got about 150 pages of her poetry left. But it'll be quite sad to have finished the Complete Poems, but actually I feel like this is me making my own selection as I'm going through, as I've been starring off poems that stand out and things like that, so that in the future I can sort of flick through and just read poems at random and have an idea of which ones have had an effect on me in the past, and if I want to reevaluate them. So it's this initial kind of selection, and then it's something I can keep on editing and playing with as the years go on. Victober, probably the main event that I'm going to try and engage with in this month. The main one I'll read will be George and Weedon Grossmith's The Diary of Nobody. And I think for all the ones I'll read in October, I'll just read you the synopsis. So this is Diary of a Nobody. Mr. Pooter is a man of modest ambitions, content with his ordinary life, yet he always seems to be troubled by disagreeable tradesmen, impertinent young office clerks, and wayward friends, not to mention his devil-may-care son, Lupin, with his unsuitable choice of bride. Try as he might, he cannot avoid life's embarrassing mishaps. In the bumbling, absurd, yet ultimately endearing figure of Pooter, the Grossmiths created an immortal comic character and a superb satire on the snobberies of middle class suburbia, one which also sends up late Victorian crazes for spiritualism and bicycling, as well as the fashion for publishing diaries by anybody and everybody. And so that's just a sort of fun piece of Victorian writing, and I think it'll get me in that Victorian mood, as it's got these it's got Weedon Grossmith's original illustrations in there. So I think it will get me in that sort of Victorian state of mind. And then I'll jump past this one next in the pile. I want to break the rules and read 2 books that were written in the Victorian period, but they're not written in Britain or America, so they don't really count, I suppose. as Victorian. One of them is The House of Ullua by Emilia Pardo Bazán. So this is written in Spain, and it's apparently one of the greatest 19th century Spanish novels. The House of Ullua follows pure and pious Father Julian Alvarez, who is sent to a remote country estate to put the affairs of the Marquis, an irresponsible libertine, in order. When he discovers moral decadence, cruelty, and corruption at this new home, Julian's well-meaning but ineffectual attempts to prevent the fall of the House of Ullua end in tragedy. Combining Gothic elements with humour and social satire, The House of Ullua is the finest achievement of Emilia Pardo Bazán, a prolific writer, feminist, traveller, and intellectual, and one of the most dynamic figures of her time. A writer I've not read before, so I haven't read the Grossmiths either, but seems very intriguing since I barely even dipped my toe in the water of Spanish literature, really, so that'll be interesting. And then one from France, we've got Guy de Maupassant, Pierre and Jean, which, from what I can tell, is a kind of Cain and Abel situation. So it says, the fraternal love that Pierre Roland feels for his younger brother Jean has always been tinged with jealousy. But when a lawyer arrives at the house of their parents to declare that an old family friend has bequeathed his entire fortune to Jean, this envy rapidly becomes an all-consuming force. Despising himself for the hate he feels, Pierre roams the seaport of Le Havre alone, desperate to come to terms with his brother's success. As he walks through the streets, however, one thought dominates his mind. Why was he not left a share of the friend's estate? Vivid, ironical, and emotionally profound, Pierre and Jean is considered Maupassant's greatest novel, an intensely personal story of suspicion, jealousy, and family love. So a bit of a twist on that, because the feelings are a little more complicated, I suppose. But yeah, one I've had around for a while, and I've just read one short story from Maupassant, I believe, which I can't remember, so it'll be good to read that. And then another one for Victober. I might save this one for later in October. I want to reread Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. So this has got the poem Goblin Market in here, as well as some of her others. I really love Christina Rossetti. And I can remember once when I was stuck at a train station, I was just daydreaming about turning Goblin Market into like a little stop animation short film. I have no experience in that kind of thing, so I wouldn't be able to do it, but I was just imagining just how cool it would be if you could do that, a kind of sort of like Labyrinth, kind of that style of puppetry and animation, and but I don't know. Don't know where I'm going with that, but I really like Goblin Market. And then just a few more things. I want to read The Border by Erica Fatland for Historathon for this last quarter. And I made a video about the books I want to read for Historathon just a few days ago. So you can check that out if you want to hear a bit more of a teaser for The Border. And then, like Sebald, I've got a few other slightly more recent European authors that I have just not got around to reading yet, or I've read one or two books by and really want to get to. And in that category, where I've tasted them and I want more, is Laszlo Krasznahorkai. So I might try and read Satan Tango later in the month if I have time. I'm going to prioritise the 19th century literature and the Historathon reading, but if it feels like there's a space opening up and I could read something else, I might read Satan Tango. A nice short synopsis actually, so we'll read this. In the darkening embers of a communist utopia, life in a Hungarian town has come to a virtual standstill. Flies buzz, spiders weave, water drips, and the animals root desultoriously, how do you say that word? Desultorially in the barnyard of a collective farm. But when the charismatic Eremias, long thought dead, returns to the commune, the villagers fall under his spell. Is he a prophet, a secret agent, or the devil himself? I've heard this is very good, and yet this is one of those books where you could spend a whole day listening to people talk about it on BookTube and actually really learn very little about the book itself. I think it's kind of one of those ones where people don't want to give it away too much, and so I'll be intrigued to find out for myself. And then finally, I've got a buddy read with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics. I just say now at the end that Wolf Hall was a buddy read I did with him and Randy Ray. And me and Alan are going to read The Wasteland. I'm going to read this. It's a facsimile and transcript of the drafts, and it's also got the sort of first, the text of the first edition in the back there as well. So I'll be reading the poem itself, but I'll also be going through the drafts and seeing how the poem changed over time, which is something I've read about and heard about, but not actually gone in and had a look into those first drafts. And just from having a look at the first page, it's one of those things that I think kind of makes you feel a bit better. This is like a big monumental poem, and yet just seeing, just seeing how ineffective the original opening was, it makes you feel a bit better about editing. So that'll be fun to jump into. But that's it. I feel like I've been talking for quite some time, so I'll leave it there. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you had a wonderful September and best wishes for October. See you soon. Bye bye.